I'd like to talk about anthropocentrism in human design. There's this idea that by saying the human is special in some way on Earth, or that Earth is special in some way in our solar system, or that our solar system is special in some way in our, Milky Way, and so on, or that the Milky Way is special, and on and on. You get the idea. There's this idea that saying we're special is just going to be one more gotcha for humanity. Same as Freud said, gotcha. There were 3 blows, with Freud himself laying the final blow to humanity's hubris. And those 3 blows were the dethroning or decentering of us from the center of our own, basically, solar system, realizing we go around the sun, and then decentering us with Darwin. First we had Copernicus, then we had Darwin, then we had Freud himself. Darwin dethroned us from the top of the food chain, at least insofar as, sure, we're the alpha predator, sure, we're the top, we're exceptional in some sense, but at least according to Freud's narrative, Darwin's dethroning, it was still a strike against humanity's hubris, because it was effectively saying, hey, look, you're not put here through divine right of kings and through made in God's image, you were put here through evolution from monkeys. So, but here's the thing. Already Rick Tarnas has pointed out, and I used to love to bring this up around the time when Ray Brassier had a lot of cachet in philosophy circles in the late aughts, I guess you would call them. I never used that word, but the 2008, 2009, 2010, and I guess even early 2010s. Nile Unbound, Ray Brassier's book, was saying, the eventual heat death of the universe and the fact that meaning is only retroactively constituted from a particular vantage point shows that the ultimate future vantage point of heat death of the universe and absolute destruction proves beyond any reasonable doubt the meaninglessness of everything. So he calls it Nile Unbound because he proves nihilism, right? But then meanwhile, you have Tarnas, Richard Tarnas, known as Rick. He should just put Rick on his books. I don't know why he doesn't. Who he defends the idea of anthropocentrism in some form, or human exceptionalism and so on, through his incredible essays leading up to his work, and included in his work Cosmos and Psyche. Essays like Two Suitors, a Parable, and Introduction to Archetypal Astrology, and I don't know, there's one more. But anyway, he kind of has a thought experiment. So what Rick Tarnas says, he has this thought experiment. And his thought experiment says, let's assume for a moment that the universe, which has been characterized in so many different ways throughout history, is not really fully done revealing the mysteries of her characterization, even, we could say. And the genders, because of course in human design we realize that our universe in particular is base 4 yin yang, which is one of the yin bases. So in some sense our universe is female in that sense, you could say. And so in any case, there's this idea, this thought experiment from Rick Tarnas, kind of contra Ray Brassier. And Rick Tarnas goes, okay, so let's say you characterize, the universe as soulless, as an automaton, as unintelligent, as basically devoid of all purpose, devoid of all meaning, devoid of anything like reason, the reasons why we do things, or the entire chiaroscuro and range of human experience, or any of that, devoid of the palate. You kind of render this sort of universe sans texture, sans narrative, sans story of any kind, personality of any kind, character of any kind. Basically, it's a very, very limited, almost Newtonian view of the universe, although even an Einsteinian quantum relativity, relativistic view, doesn't fully take into account, except maybe metaphorically, that certain things are not accounted for by the mechanistic view, in the sense that, any quantum mechanics begins where classical mechanics ends. But really, when we learn in base theory and human design about the 9 dimensions, we learn, there are the 4 Einsteinian dimensions, the 3 dimensions we know of, plus time. But then there's the 5 dimensions of base. And these 5 dimensions really are dimensions just as much as those others are dimensions. There's a dimensionality to them. And, so for Tarnas, he's not a human design guy, of course. I mean, he's an astrology guy. But even with astrology, he's like a Hillmanian, Jungian, archetypal, Stanislav Grof, integral studies astrology guy, and it's great. I love his work just about as much as I love Jason Hawley's work, which takes in more evolutionary astrology, but interacts with and engages with Jungian, Hillmanian, all this stuff. Really enjoyable. So what Tarnas has in his thought experiment, he goes, well, let's say that you imagine this completely mechanistic soulless world devoid of anything you call human. Now, on the other hand, let's imagine you just take the universe as it is, kind of experientially. Like, let's put on our Merleau-Ponty hat. That's not Tarnas saying that. That's just me saying, for those not familiar with Merleau-Ponty, he's a phenomenologist who's basically a scholar of lived life experience. What is it like to be this or that? It's actually interesting that these phenomenologists and kind of subjective Husserlian, Heideggerian, and so on strain of people are so different and yet have such an affinity with the analytic philosophers, which I think is all around personality type, with the analytic philosophers being a lot of thinking dominant, and particularly extroverted thinking with introverted sensing, which you tend to find a lot of also, but just with more of the sensing dominance, the introverted sensing dominance, and the phenomenologists, because they are the ones who are so fascinated by the phenomenological lived life experience. Introverted sensing is all about the subjective impressions of life. So in any case, without going too far afield into personality typology, I'll just say what Tarnas does is he kind of presents these 2 versions of the universe. The version that sees the universe as something you participate with, that's intelligent, that's interacting with you, that, like basically what he's saying, you can see all of the transits and you can see the planetary motions and sort of make out that something is happening. He intimates that something is happening. He doesn't have the mechanistic explanation of neutrinos that we have in human design. And it's interesting that human design is simultaneously more mechanistic, while also even less, about robbing it of its own spirit and so on. One moment. Hello. Archetypal astrology can kind of rob, or I guess I'll just say, I've found a sort of deadening effect or dulling effect to the archetypal astrology and evolutionary astrology's existence in a sort of paradigm of healing and boundaries and trauma and all of these personality disorder diagnoses. And, there's this whole world of language that to me is deeply self-centered, and that these systems haven't been able to break free from. Despite that, I will say Cosmos and Psyche is completely genius, and I love Rick Tarnas' work. I mean, it's great. It's a work of genius. It's just what he was genius about was really taking it seriously to say, no, look, if you actually look at just the archetypes involved, and if you even understand that our Western, something I love about Rick Tarnas, very compatible in this sense with human design, where he says our Western understandings of the planets are so limited for the transpersonal planets, for Neptune. Maya is a way richer idea of Neptune than some sea god. And Maya can be personified in a feminine form much more than, and in addition to masculine, and so on. And so Rick Tarnas really does open up a lot of great things here. But okay, so to bring it back to his thought experiment, his sort of parable, he goes, so you have these two ways of characterizing the world. Who do you think the world's, or who do you think, not even the world, but the universe really? Who do you think the universe is going to open up its secrets for? The person, and it's kind of a funny idea because it's like doubling down on anthropomorphism. But then he says something great, and he goes, look, we do need to continue to dethrone humans. This is me paraphrasing now, but he says basically, yeah, let's dethrone ourselves from this sort of hubristic place of we are at the we're the best and so on. Let's do that, sure. But isn't that a great conceit? And again, this is paraphrasing, but I'll put it in my own words, trying to basically express what he said. I wish I could remember it, word for word. Isn't it a great conceit to imagine all the meaning, purpose, love, beauty, values, ethics, reason, all of this, intelligence, all of these things that we say are characteristics of that when we're anthropomorphizing and imbuing something mechanistic and soulless with all of these human characteristics, isn't it actually the most conceit to say those are human in the first place? In other words, to lay claim to them as human. And I've been saying this for 10 years now. This is not new. This is actually one of my early talking points from 2011, 2012, when I was really getting into engaging with the archetypal astrological viewpoint vis-a-vis contemporary philosophy from the last 100 years. So looking at philosophical work and looking at the work of people like Ray Brassier, who's saying, look, we shouldn't, here's the thing, Ray Brassier, Levi Bryant, Paul Ennis, who came up with bleak theory, all these kind of nihilistic sort of people, David Rodin, they all understand, I would hope, and love the irony of it, and kind of ironically embrace the nihilism in a sort of fun way. But I would hope that they wouldn't take it very seriously, because to take it seriously, it's like, here's the thing. Ray Brassier is saying, look, it's our job. Or I guess he's not saying it's our job to do this. He doesn't really engage in the internet stuff. But, Levi Bryant, for instance, who has the blog Larval Subjects and is really engaged in a lot of philosophical discussion, has been for years and years. He basically would say it's one of his, it's partly his job to root out superstitious, magical thinking, and to point out where people who believe in astrology or something as stupid as that, right, or human design from their perspective, these dumb ideas. How could you imagine that the world could work this magical way, right? How could you imagine it works this way? Like it's built for you almost, like it's designed. How could, from their perspective is what they're asking. And they're saying, how could you imagine it's this way? Now, the thing is, they're imagining this whole time that purpose, having a purpose in life, is something human. Or rather, it's like they don't see that it's human, so they just assume that it's human without realizing they're assuming that it's human. It's hard to describe, but it's almost like okay, I'll take my opponent's perspective, then my perspective. My opponent's perspective says, it's our job as philosophers to root out superstition. We need to be scientific rationalists. And when people believe magical things like astrology or human design, we should tell them they're wrong and try to convince them they're wrong, right? So that's what my opponent says. That's like a Levi Bryant type. And then he'll say, you know, we need to do this because what's happened is since the Enlightenment, we've progressively realized through people like Ray Brassier even, that the ultimate heat death of the universe proves that it's all meaningless anyway. So the most we can do, you know, I would imagine he would say is sort of existentialist, you know, craft or create some meaning through your phantasmatic supports, through your little neurotic life. Now, here's the thing. Here's the problem with all this. All of this assumes that the human is thrown into the meaningless world. Even Heidegger makes this mistake, this thrownness. I mean, to a degree, Heidegger makes this mistake. Is that we're thrown into the world, right? But the point is, it's the imagination that the world itself is cold and machinic and doesn't care about us. And in some sense, you know, that we like imagine some sort of world without human. And then the human is thrown into it. But this is the actual fantasy. This is the actual fantasy, right? This is what's so funny is like, it's hard to describe, but like, so my opponent, and here's why I say, by the way, that Heidegger only to a degree. Early Heidegger very much makes the mistake, but then later Heidegger recovers it through his understanding of like his essay on gathering and like poetry and all this stuff, where he's talking about the sort of unity of the material, the physical world, and the sort of spiritual / symbolic / linguistic world, and how they coexist, i.e. the physical and mental Maya, and how they inform and interact with each other and engage with each other and all this stuff. So later Heidegger, I feel like, kind of gets it. I mean, not to say that I fully get Heidegger either, because he was a mad genius in some ways and just a madman in other ways, and I also don't want to ever condone any of his political views, of course. So, but in any case, you can see how my opponent will basically say it's their job to fight for rationalism and to root out superstition and magical thinking. Because they'll say, look, superstition is behind all religion, it's behind all war, it's behind all, you know, they'll basically pin all of that on astrology and human design. So people believing mystical systems, which, by the way, believing mystical system, I don't even like using the word belief. I mean, I have beliefs about mystical systems, and I have beliefs about the world informed by mystical systems. What I really like to do is say that I'm part of a metaphysical research program. And the idea of being involved is an ontological research program. It's a research program into the nature of reality, in the sense of Thomas Kuhn and his scientific research programs. So my opponent goes, it's my job to root out all this magical thinking. Now, what they say to me is, look, Jonah, don't you see that you're just projecting human qualities? You're so anthropocentric, they think that I don't see the humanness, the personalness of it when I, for instance, observe a synchronistic occurrence and say, look, something synchronistic happened. You know, this meaningful coincidence happened, right? So my version of reality is that effectively it is mechanistic, but it's mechanistic, you know, where the mechanism is the sort of entirety of every possible configuration. It's almost a finite, limited set of possible stories. It's like, that's why I say human design is like TV tropes. If people have not seen TV tropes, please go to tvtropes.com. It's so awesome. Look it up. Side note, I'm on there, and I did not make my account on there. I don't know who did, but if you did and you're watching this video, thank you. I thought it was really fun. TV tropes is so much fun. It shows you how limited it all is, how limited the Maya is. It shows you the no-choiceness of it all, that everything's just kind of a variation. Same with the Dramatica film and screenwriting analysis system. Not Encyclopedia Dramatica. That is kind of like a 4chan type, it's something else. But if you actually look up and actually look up the Dramatica screenwriting techniques, Dramatica screenwriting analysis, things like that, you'll find it's very limited. It shows you that to make a complete story, you're limited in all of these ways. And this is kind of what No Choice is all about. So, again, my opponent, and I hate to say opponent, but it's like I've been in this position again and again and again in philosophy. It's been a few years now as I've kind of withdrawn. But I used to be in this position again and again and again when I was a big proponent of Rick Tarnas of Cosmos and Psyche. So I'd be engaging with pretty top people, Alex Williams, one of the guys who worked on the Accelerationist Manifesto, Nick Sternicek, platform capitalism guy, and I'd be writing and engaging with these people on Facebook discussions. Catherine Malibu, really interesting, not to just name drop, but just saying, these were the kinds of thinkers. Really big fan of Catherine Malibu. Love her work on Bergson, and she was on a panel with Ray Brassier. And she was the only defendant of Bergson. She was on that panel with Adrian Johnston and who's the Heidegger scholar and Derrida scholar. He's really good. So, but anyway, I love this stuff. I mean, I love this world of philosophers, and yet I've had opponents again and again and again who said it's their job to sort of rid the world of magical thinking. Now, luckily, that's not that common. I don't think Catherine Malibu would say that. I can't imagine. I don't think, a lot of people would say that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, this is really what Rick Tarnas challenges us to imagine is, what if all of these things that we are attributing to the human are actually not human at all? What if they're for instance, I can kind of translate what he's saying into human design speak. Mammals, for instance, have 15 gates, or have access to the 15 gates. The 15 gates activate compared to humans having 64. It'd be funny, if we have one more gate. No, my bad. 64, of course, as everyone knows, the 64 in the wheel. So only 15 of those 64 are present in the mammalian chart. And there's even less, I forget if it's 5 in plants or something, or 6, or, there's even less, and so on. And so plants don't take part in the human experiential way. In fact, neither do mammals. They don't have the human experiential way gates, but they do have 3 connections to humans. So here's the anthropocentrism. The anthropocentrism is more, or the human exceptionalism of human design is not saying, it's different than the human exceptionalism. It's almost inverse of the human exceptionalism of my opponents, philosophically speaking, like Levi Bryant, who would be saying, their human exceptionalism is that they basically imagine the world as completely devoid of all meaning, and then they imagine humans as the sole arbiters of meaning in an otherwise meaningless cosmos. Human is the sole one that would project purpose out onto a purposeless void. Human is the one who has to create realities as coping mechanisms to deal with the shattering reality, the shattering fact of the randomness and the tininess of us, and the fact there are probably millions of countless other, lifetimes and so on, and that once we die, and that's it, and there's no afterlife, and so on. It's not like human design is saying there's an afterlife. Human design is saying there's reincarnation. Human design is saying decisions are important because the decision making that we make is ultimately important for the ultimate reincarnation that is not even an incarnation, because carne is meat. It's more what's the word? Embedding, it's an embed nation into bedrock of, not really bedrock, but I'm thinking because I play Minecraft a lot, we will eventually be these silicon creatures that err on. And so human design actually does give an explanation. But even without going as far as human design, here is Rick Tarnas' point in his thought experiment. He says, okay, I'm an archetypal astrologer. I say that Jupiter symbolizes magnanimity, a magnanimous, generous Santa Claus energy. Saturn symbolizes conservative, constriction and Father Time and the Grim Reaper and all this stuff. Pluto is volcanic, and Neptune is dreamy and escapist. You can go through all of them. Mars with its impetuous, hasty, immature, that's kind of how we think of it in human design, or more traditionally just fiery. Although Mars also is mutative, we consider it to be about mutation in human design, and so on. So we can have all of these connotations, and on the Tarnas side, what he's saying is that these characteristics and qualities are built into the very fabric of the mechanism of the incarnative process and of the evolutionary process, and that evolution itself is sort of keyed to these massive planetary cycles. And you can see the social versions of this happening, and so on. So, I mean, through society changing, and then you can see biological versions. Not that Tarnas goes into that as much, but I'm sure if we were to go at a much larger scale, it follows in this sort of as above, so below way that, everything Tarnas is saying is perfectly compatible with modern science, with evolutionary theory, just like everything human design is saying is. All Tarnas is saying is, when we make all these human associations with the planets, yes, those are cultural, just like we can criticize and say, hey, maybe the characterizations we have here of certain planets aren't as good as others. Neptune might not be a really useful characterization for us. We can maybe think of the Maya instead for that symbolism, and so on. So it's not that, and also Tarnas kind of decoupled the genders from the planets and could say, look, there is a female version of Mars. It's the Amazon warrior woman. And there's a male version of Venus. It's the dandy, the Oscar Wilde, the kind of Wildean wit, and so on. Okay, well, I don't want to go too far afield here, but in any case, Tarnas is kind of saying that all of these characteristics, yes, there are culturally significant, culturally accumulated associations, but there are also, I guess we could even just say built-in chemistries or built-in dynamics, built-in interactions between these archetypal planets, such that we can interpret when Saturn conjuncts Pluto, we interpret that in its own way, or when Jupiter conjuncts, Uranus, or when Neptune conjuncts Venus, and so on. We can interpret these. Now, in human design, I don't really do that as much. I would love to, by the way, revisit Cosmos and Psyche through the lens of human design and look at the key junctures and key points that he's pointed out, and look at, from the human design lens, where these conjunctions happened and so on, and these major transits. But in any case, so, Tarnas will say all of these characteristics, yeah, we might project certain characteristics on them, but they're also accumulated in the way that these are just culturally, we've learned to associate certain things with a planetary kind of archetypal energy. Now, the accumulation of associations is what my opponents would say that's what they have to fight against, the folk wisdom that's accumulated. Fight against that folk wisdom, replace it with science fact. But what I'm saying is that accumulation is still simply an accumulation of impressions of something that is not merely projected by humans as the sole arbiter of meaning in an otherwise meaningless cosmos. It's an intimation or even an interaction with, an engagement with, sort of fundamental building blocks, i.e. archetypes, of the total possible narratives that could exist for humans.